The wind moved quietly through the buckthorn thicket, bending the thin branches as if sweeping aside the final veil of a secret long kept beneath the soil. The search team had worked in near silence all morning, each step slow, deliberate, respectful. This place felt wrong from the moment they arrived, not because it looked unusual, but because it felt untouched, as though no living thing had dared disturb it for years. The earth held a strange density, a heaviness, the way ground sometimes does when it has carried the weight of memory for too long. Detective Mara Leland stood a short distance away, watching the handlers guide their dogs through the patch of undergrowth. She had been in cold case work long enough to know that most days ended in disappointment, but today carried a different texture, a quiet urgency she couldn't explain. The discovery of an object the week prior had pulled the team toward this forgotten corner of Pine Hollow, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The forest around them breathed in slow, muted breaths. The air smelled of damp bark and the metallic hint of early frost. Each movement seemed amplified, the soft thud of boots against the ground, the brittle snap of twigs, the occasional rustle of leaves disturbed by small animals unseen. And beneath it all, an unspoken tension, like a question no one wanted to voice aloud. One of the dogs paused. Its ears twitched, body going still in a way that triggered instinct before logic. The handler lowered his voice, whispering encouragement, but the animal hardly needed it. Nose low, it pressed forward, pulling him toward a shallow pocket between the roots of an old buckthorn tree. The soil there looked slightly darker than the rest, a subtle shade difference someone without training might have missed entirely. The handler raised a hand. Everyone froze. Another dog approached and took the same position, head bowed, muscles tense. The forest seemed to silence itself, as though waiting. Mara stepped closer, feeling the temperature drop, or perhaps imagining it. Her throat tightened without warning. 25 years of paperwork, witness statements, false leads, and sleepless nights had led to this patch of earth no wider than a doorway. A technician knelt beside the trees, brushing away the topmost layer of leaves and roots. The soil yielded too easily. Beneath the first layer, a thin depression appeared, shallow, deliberate, intentional. The kind of disturbance that nature does not make on its own. Time had tried to erase it, but not well enough. The air thickened with a collective understanding. The technician cleared a bit more, stopping as something pale emerged from the soil, something out of place among the browns and grays of the forest floor. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The moment settled heavily into every chest, a mixture of dread and relief melding together in a way that made no emotional sense at all. Mara stepped closer, her breath forming a faint cloud. She had imagined this moment so many times that it almost felt unreal. And yet, standing there, she understood that this was the closest thing to truth the town had come to in decades. The silence surrounding the team carried a weight that was not mournful, but solemn, like the quiet after a long-awaited confession. Far behind the search perimeter, the trees opened into a small clearing. From where she stood, Mara could see the faint outline of something familiar, a ridge of old fence wire half swallowed by vines. It matched the scratch pattern found on the object that led them here. It was the missing piece that had been waiting unseen for all these years, the silent witness to a night that had stolen a child from his world. Her mind drifted to the Mercer family. The years had been unkind to them, carving lines of waiting into their faces, shaping their days around an absence that never softened. She had seen the way Eli's mother touched her son's photographs, the gentleness in her gestures as if afraid that even the memory of him might break apart from being held too tightly. She had seen the way his older brother stood behind her, always slightly off-center, living a life shaped by the hollowed-out place where another life should have been. Finding this sight would not undo any of that, but it would close a chapter that had remained painfully open for far too long. A gloved hand lifted a small fragment from the soil, just a piece of fabric, frayed and nuded from decades underground. One of the technicians placed it into a sterile container. The moment marked the beginning of the confirmation everyone already felt deep within them. This was the place. This was where the truth had waited. Mara exhaled slowly, the cold air filling her lungs with something sharp but strangely cleansing. The forest remained silent, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt like a place that had been carrying a burden and was finally setting it down. She looked toward the ridge of trees that bordered the western approach and felt the weight of the entire investigation shift. Every assumption, every missed clue, every moment when the case had gone dark, they all converged here, in this pocket of soil and memory. For years, Pine Hollow had lived with a question that had no answer. Today, the question had been met with a whisper of truth rising from beneath the earth. To understand how this began, we go back to 1991. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. In Pine Hollow, mornings carried a particular softness that seemed made for childhood. The light came slow across the fields, moving over the tops of the corn and settling gently on the houses built decades earlier by families who rarely moved away. On most days, the first sound on the Mercer property was the rhythmic creak of bicycle pedals turning in the driveway. Eli always rode in circles before school, testing the brakes, adjusting the seat, and then leaning forward as if already chasing some imagined breeze. He was a boy who filled quiet spaces with energy rather than noise. His father often said that Eli didn't run through the world. He flowed through it, drifting from one interest to another with a curiosity that made even simple things feel important. His mother used to find small collections under his bed. Smooth stones sorted by color, paper scraps he insisted looked like maps, bottle caps lined up according to which ones caught the most sunlight. The Mercer's house rested at the edge of a narrow gravel road, surrounded by birch trees that shimmered when the wind moved through them. Eli loved those trees. He said they whispered. When he walked to the bus stop each morning, he trailed his fingers along their bark, tapping out a rhythm like a secret message only he understood. His older brother, Ryan, 2 years ahead in school, teased him for it, sometimes never cruelly, just with the gentle exasperation of someone already beginning to step into adolescence. Yet when Ryan thought no one was watching, he too slowed his steps near the trees, glancing at Eli as if trying to hear what the boy claimed to hear. At school, Eli was the kind of child who teachers remembered without needing to check the attendance sheet. He sat near the window in most classes, not because he was easily distracted, but because he liked seeing the world outside shift throughout the day. He doodled small shapes in the margins of his notebooks, mostly stars and arrows pointing toward nothing in particular. He played soccer during recess, though he never cared much about winning. What mattered to him was movement, the sensation of running in grass, the unpredictable bounce of the ball, the quick laughter of his friends. One of them, a boy named Jonah, lived down the road. Their friendship was stitched together by shared routines, racing bicycles on weekends, skipping stones at Miller's Creek, and poking around the abandoned grain silo, even though they had promised their parents they would stay away from it. Jonah was louder, more impulsive, the kind of boy who shouted challenges into the wind. Eli balanced him, bringing a steady thoughtfulness to their adventures. Together, they made Pine Hollow feel larger than it was, turning every forgotten shed and narrow path into something worth exploring. The Mercers were not wealthy. Their home was simple, lived in, with carpets worn smooth in the places where family members paced most often. But warmth filled the rooms in ways money never could. On weekends, Eli and his mother baked small loaves of bread that never quite looked like the cookbook photos, but always tasted good. His father repaired farm equipment for neighbors, often bringing Eli along to hand him tools. The boy liked watching how his father worked slow, careful movements, each action deliberate. When Eli asked questions, his father answered everyone, even if it took longer than the repair itself. Among Eli's belongings, one object meant more to him than the rest: a small black flashlight with a chipped lens. It wasn't new. The bulb flickered sometimes, but he carried it on every bike ride, tucked into the side pocket of his jacket or strapped with twine to the handlebars. He said it made him feel prepared, though he never explained for what. Sometimes he shined it through the slats of the barn door, pretending the beam was a guide for someone lost. Other times he lay on the floor of his room at night, turning the flashlight on and off in patterns that felt like a code. His mother asked once why he kept it with him always. He shrugged and said, "It's good to have light." She didn't press further. Parents learn to recognize the small treasures children attach meaning to. Some have reasons, some do not. The significance of a thing is often known only to the child who holds it. Late autumn in Pine Hollow carried a different kind of quiet. The trees thinned, the roads emptied earlier in the day, and the air felt colder than the weather suggested. Nights grew long but never threatening. Families trusted the darkness here. Children still played outside after dusk, chasing each other with laughter that echoed across the open fields. Eli enjoyed these evenings most. He liked how shadows stretched across familiar paths, transforming them into places he wanted to understand better. The last week of his life looked no different than any other. Each day followed its usual rhythm: school, chores, homework, play. His mother remembered how he lingered beside the refrigerator door one night, staring at a photo of himself and Ryan taken at the creek the previous summer. She asked what he was looking at. He said he liked the way the water shimmered in the picture. She smiled, shook her head gently, and went back to cleaning the dishes. His father remembered him sitting in the barn earlier that same week, repairing the strap that held his flashlight to his bike. He used a piece of old leather and 2 screws, tongue tucked between his teeth as he concentrated. When his father offered help, he declined politely. "I want to make it strong enough so it doesn't fall off," he said. The words weren't remarkable at the time. They became heavy only later. The morning of the day he disappeared began quietly, as most mornings did. Frost dusted the windows, leaving delicate shapes that caught the sunlight. Eli woke earlier than usual and ate his cereal without rushing. He packed his school things, slipping a piece of folded notebook paper into the front pocket of his backpack. It was something he had drawn the night before, lines and dots and a small star in the corner. No one understood what the drawing meant. Some believed it was a map of places he liked to visit. Others thought it was simply a child's imagination captured on paper. He left the house with Ryan, walking toward the bus stop. As they passed the birch trees, he tapped each trunk gently with the tip of his fingers, one after another, as if checking to make sure the whispers were still there. The air was cold enough to redden their noses, but the boys didn't mind. School was just another routine, another day to fill with small discoveries. At lunch, he traded half his sandwich for a cookie Jonah didn't want. In class, he answered a question about constellations with more enthusiasm than accuracy, earning an amused shake of the head from his teacher. After school, he played soccer until the sky turned a faint shade of blue that meant it was time to go home. He returned to the Mercer house in the late afternoon, dropped his backpack on the floor, and asked his mother if he could ride his bike with Jonah and another friend before dinner. She hesitated, glancing at the dimming sky, then agreed with one condition: be back before full dark. Eli promised. He always promised. He grabbed his bike, checked the leather strap on the flashlight, and tightened it one last time. The beam sputtered when he clicked it on, then steadied to a soft glow. He smiled at it, satisfied. Jonah arrived moments later, shouting for him to hurry. They pedaled toward the long stretch of rural road that curved around the cornfields, the kind of road children had traveled safely for generations. No one in Pine Hollow imagined that this ride would be his last. The boys laughed and raced along the gravel, their voices drifting across the empty fields. The sky deepened to a cool, smoky blue. A distant wind carried the smell of dry leaves. The flashlight at Eli's handlebars bounced gently with each bump in the road, its small glow flickering like a heartbeat. Later, his mother would say she remembered feeling a faint chill that evening, as if the air shifted just slightly in a way she could not explain. But nothing in their world suggested danger. Nothing hinted at how quickly a boy could vanish into the dark. The last moment anyone saw him alive was simple, ordinary, heartbreakingly normal. 3 boys riding down a familiar road, the beam of a small flashlight cutting a thin path through the rising dusk. The evening of October 12th began like countless others in Pine Hollow, with a thin veil of dusk settling over the cornfields and a faint chill creeping into the wind. The 3 boys pedaled along the gravel road, their bicycles vibrating beneath them as small stones spit from under the tires. The sky had shifted from blue to a muted smoky violet, the kind that usually signaled the start of a quiet autumn night. Eli rode in the middle, the small beam of his flashlight bobbing with each bump, casting a narrow path across the ground. At 6:57 p.m., according to later reconstruction, the boys passed the bend near Miller's Creek. The trees on either side of the road grew denser there, and the last traces of sunlight filtered through the branches in broken streaks. Jonah called out something about racing to the next fence post, and Ryan laughed, surging ahead for a few seconds before slowing again. Ayla kept a steady pace, breath forming faint clouds in the cooling air. By 7:02 p.m., the boys reached the long stretch of road bordered by open fields on one side and an overgrown windbreak of spruce and buckthorn on the other. This was the point where the terrain shifted from wide and visible to narrow and uncertain. Gravel popped under their wheels. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves, mixed with something colder, an early hint of frost. At 7:05 p.m., the headlights of a distant vehicle appeared behind them. Faint at first, little more than a soft glow on the horizon. Jonah glanced back and shrugged. Cars rarely used that road, but when they did, drivers usually slowed for children. They kept riding. The lights drew closer, then dimmed suddenly, as though flicked off or blocked by something. The boys looked over their shoulders again, but the road behind them was empty, fading into blue-gray distance. None of them commented on it. At 7:06 p.m., they reached the section of road that curved toward the old ridge fence. The windbreak thickened here, branches reaching toward the road like long fingers. It was at this point that the first sound reached them, not the sharp snap of wood or the rustle of animals, but something softer. A footstep on loose soil. A shift in weight. Jonah braked first, skidding slightly on the gravel. Ryan slowed behind him. Allie was the last to stop, the wobbling beam of his flashlight swinging forward before settling on the dirt road. Ahead of them stood a man. The boys couldn't see his face clearly. The hood of his jacket was pulled low, and the shadows swallowed everything above the line of his mouth. His hands were deep in his pockets. He stepped forward with a slow, deliberate motion, the kind that made instinct coil inside the boys' chests. His boots scraped lightly against the road. Jonah muttered something under his breath. Ryan whispered for Eli to stay behind him. The man didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, blocking the narrow path where the road dipped slightly before rising again. The air felt heavier. The branches around them stilled. Then he raised one hand, not quickly, not aggressively, but in a way that commanded attention. The boys saw the glint before they understood what it was. A small metallic shape catching the last of the dusk light. A gun. His voice came next, calm and measured, stripped of emotion. He told them to drop their bikes. Jonah froze. Ryan's breath hitched. Eli's flashlight flickered once, then steadied. The man stepped closer, telling the 2 older boys to turn around and run toward town. His voice dropped lower when he said it again. The pistol lifted a fraction, enough to make the command border uncertainty. The boys hesitated only for a second. Then they obeyed. At 7:07 p.m., Jonah and Ryan sprinted down the road, bikes abandoned on the gravel. Jonah screamed Eli's name once before Ryan yanked him forward. They didn't look back, though both later said they could feel the weight of that moment pressing into their spines as they ran. At 7:08 p.m., the flashlight beam disappeared. No one saw Eli again after that. The boys reached the Mercer house at 7:13 p.m. Ryan's chest was tight, his words broken by gasps. Their father, hearing the frantic slamming of the front door, rushed from the kitchen, trying to piece together the story through fragments of fear. Jonah repeated the same few phrases over and over. A man. He had a gun. Eli didn't run. He took him. The sheriff was called at 7:19 p.m. Patrol units were dispatched within minutes. The first search party arrived at 7:32 p.m., moving along the road with flashlights that threw shaky beams into the thickening dark. The gravel was scattered with signs of panic, the boys' bicycles, the skid marks from Jonah's stop, and Eli's bike lying on its side, the leather strap that held the flashlight now broken. The flashlight itself was missing. The officers followed the footprints where the boys had stood. Beyond that, the tracks became harder to read, impressions merging with older vehicle marks, patches of disrupted gravel, and the jagged outline of something being dragged or pulled across the dirt. But just past the ridge, they found the first clue, a small indentation near the fence line, as though something had struck the wire hard enough to bend one of the rusted barbs. The deputy shined his light on the barb. A tiny piece of darkened metal flaked away. Later analysis would connect this to the scratches on the flashlight, discovered decades afterward. But at the time, it was only another question. Search efforts expanded quickly. By 8 p.m., volunteers from Pine Hollow had gathered, forming lines across the fields. Their lights moved like fireflies through the wheat stubble and low brush. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of cold earth and distant wood smoke. Dogs were brought in from neighboring towns. Helicopters arrived before midnight, sweeping the fields with wide arcs of white light. But there was nothing. No footprints leading away, no discarded object. No sign of struggle beyond the abandoned bicycle and the broken strap. The ground kept its silence. By midnight, frost had begun to form on the edges of the fence wire. Officers moved deeper into the windbreak, pushing through tangled branches and roots, finding only deer trails and old animal burrows. Some believed they heard something at one point, a faint rustle, a muffled sound, but it was dismissed as wind or imagination. At 1:15 a.m., a deputy found a small piece of fabric snagged on a broken twig. It was pale blue, the same shade as the jacket Eli had worn earlier that day. It was placed into an evidence bag. No other pieces were recovered. Between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m., temperatures dropped sharply. Mist formed near the creek bed, creating a thin haze that obscured the deeper parts of the forest. The search continued until daylight, then through the next day, and the next. Nothing. The boys repeated their statements with slight variations, trying to recall details through fear-clouded memory. They described the man's jacket, the way he stood, the cadence of his voice. They remembered the glint of metal, the moment he lifted the gun, the fear that pushed them into running. But they disagreed on one detail, whether the man had emerged from the trees or had been standing in the road waiting. This uncertainty would haunt the early investigation. The first discovery of significance, though its meaning wasn't understood, then came on the third day of searching. A deputy found a faint depression near an old drainage ditch, half hidden under fallen leaves. It looked like a footprint, but the pattern was unclear, blurred by moisture and animal tracks. Nearby, a small irregular patch of soil appeared slightly lighter than the surrounding ground, as though disturbed and then covered again. The supervising officer dismissed it as natural erosion. The detail was logged but never followed up. The search widened. The timeline was reconstructed again and again. Witness interviews expanded to surrounding farms, gas stations, and out-of-town workers passing through. Some remembered seeing a vehicle near the area earlier that day. Others recalled nothing unusual at all. Tips flooded the sheriff's office, most of them dead ends. By the end of the first week, hope had begun to fray. Searchers returned home. Volunteers dwindled. The road where Eli had vanished became a place people avoided at dusk, not because they believed danger still lingered, but because the silence there felt too heavy. Across Pine Hollow, porch lights were left burning longer. Children were kept indoors. Conversations hushed whenever the Mercers walked into a room. The investigation drifted into uncertainty. With no body, no confirmed suspect, and no significant evidence, the case entered the early stages of stagnation. But one thing remained, lingering at the periphery of every officer's mind: the broken strap on Eli's bicycle. The strap had been torn, not sliced. It required force. More importantly, the flashlight it once held was missing entirely. Some assumed it had been dropped during the abduction. Others suggested the man might have taken it. No one could agree. The odd detail lay in the fact that the boys had heard no struggle, no scuffle, no shout, no sound of metal hitting the ground. If the flashlight had fallen, it should have made noise. But the boys heard nothing except the man's voice and the pounding of their own footsteps as they ran. The flashlight vanished without a trace that night. Its absence would shadow the entire investigation for decades, waiting silently for the moment when it would finally speak. The early weeks after Eli's disappearance passed in a blur of urgency and frantic search patterns, but by the end of the first month, the investigation began to settle into the slower, heavier rhythm that often signals a case losing momentum. Pine Hollow stayed on alert. Patrol cars crawled through neighborhoods late at night, and parents watched their children with a protectiveness that bordered on fear. Yet for all the visibility, the heart of the investigation remained lodged in uncertainty. The sheriff's department established a task force within 2 weeks, gathering officers from neighboring towns. They re-walked the route the boys had traveled, marked every possible angle, and reconstructed the timeline so many times that the numbers blurred. They interviewed anyone who had been within 10 miles of the road that night: farm hands, truck drivers, night shift workers, and they revisited the same conversations again and again, hoping memory might loosen one new detail. The first major suspect emerged in mid-November, when a ranch worker named Carl Breton was arrested on an unrelated charge. He matched a vague description provided by Jonah: medium height, brown jacket, quiet voice. Breton had a history of minor offenses, and he had been seen driving near the ridge the week of the disappearance. Detectives brought him in for questioning, keeping the conversation calm at first. They asked where he had been that night. He claimed he had been home, drinking. They asked whether anyone could confirm it. He shrugged and said no. They asked why he was in Pine Hollow earlier that week. He said he had been buying machine parts for his employer. When they pressed, he grew agitated, rubbing his palms together, eyes darting toward the door. The press covered the interrogation heavily, reporting that authorities were closing in on the man responsible. The Mercer family received phone calls from strangers insisting that Breton must be the one. The sheriff's office experienced a flood of public pressure to charge him. But within days, the forensic team cleared him. Soil samples from his truck didn't match the roadside where the boys had last seen Eli. He had no scratches on his arms or clothing, consistent with moving through the dense windbreak. And more importantly, his work logs placed him 2 towns away earlier in the evening. The timeline didn't fit. When detectives told him he was free to go, Breton muttered that the town needed a real suspect, not a convenient one. He walked out of the station without looking back. The disappointment seeped through the task force. Officers who had worked 15-hour days slumped in their chairs, rubbing tired eyes. Coffee cups multiplied. Notes and diagrams on whiteboards grew cluttered and confusing. Another suspect came to their attention shortly after New Year's. A drifter named Warren Pike had been seen camping near Miller's Creek that month. Locals claimed he stared too long at children in the market and spoke in ways that made them uneasy. Detectives found him walking along the highway, carrying a backpack stuffed with blankets and canned food. His clothes were torn, his hair unkempt, his face sharp with the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping outdoors, night after night. During questioning, Pike said he didn't know anything about the boy. He said he didn't even know Pine Hollow had a school. Detectives found nothing in his pack but a worn Bible, a pocket knife, and several coins taped together with electrical tape. Still, many in town were convinced he had taken Eli. Pressure mounted again, this time from citizens who believed the police were ignoring someone obviously dangerous. The sheriff held a community meeting, assuring residents that suspicion alone was not enough to hold Pike. A mother stood and shouted, "You're going to let him walk away and hope he doesn't do the same thing again." The sheriff replied, voice even, "We cannot invent evidence." Pike was released. He left Pine Hollow within a day. Through the winter, more leads trickled in. A hunter claimed he saw a man carrying something heavy near the ridge. A teenager insisted he heard a child's voice crying late at night. A farmer reported seeing tire tracks behind his barn. Each tip was checked, cataloged, and concluded with the same phrase in the case file: insufficient evidence. The Mercer family visited the sheriff's office weekly during those months. Sometimes both parents came, other times only Eli's mother. She always carried a notebook full of questions, though she rarely managed to ask them all. When the officers explained the latest developments, she nodded politely, even when the information was clearly painful. One afternoon, she asked a deputy, "Do you think he felt alone out there?" The deputy hesitated before answering. "We don't know," he said gently. She lowered her gaze and closed the notebook. As spring approached, investigators re-examined every detail of the boy's statements. Jonah insisted the man had emerged from the trees. Ryan believed he had been standing in the road already. Their memories were shaped by fear and darkness, and detectives tried not to blame them for the contradictions. A psychologist consulted by the task force wrote in his report, "Children under threat recall impressions, not details." It didn't bring clarity. It only reaffirmed what they already knew. The picture they were trying to piece together was incomplete. In May, the task force interviewed a former farmhand named Raymond Holt, who lived on the edge of town. He had left Pine Hollow shortly after the disappearance, a fact that instantly drew attention. He returned months later for a family matter and agreed to speak with detectives. He arrived at the station looking calm, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He answered their questions carefully, never raising his voice or appearing defensive. He said he had been home that night. He said he had heard the commotion in town only the next morning. He said he didn't know the Mercer family personally, but had seen the boys ride their bikes occasionally. Detectives noted that he offered no unnecessary details. His tone was even, his eyes steady. Nothing about him matched the frantic, unpredictable behavior they expected from someone guilty of a violent crime. After a routine background check and a search of his property, they released him. His name would later fade into the background, swallowed by dozens of other suspects who came and went. Over the next 2 years, the investigation followed the same weary cycle: a rumor, a lead, a suspect, a dead end. The case files grew thicker. The sheriff's office held fewer briefings. Families talked about the disappearance only when they had to, lowering their voices as though speaking softly might somehow prevent more pain. By the 3rd year, new cases demanded attention. Officers rotated out of the task force due to transfers or burnout. A few remained, driven by a sense of responsibility that bordered on obsession. One deputy, known for carrying the case folder with him long after work hours, described it as a weight that settles deeper the longer you hold it. The Mercer household changed as well. Ryan grew quieter, withdrawing from friends. He stopped riding his bike. He spent evenings in his room, staring at the same photo his mother loved, the one taken by the creek. She kept Eli's room just as he left it, except for the dust she wiped away each week. Every birthday, she placed a candle on the table and lit it, letting it burn until it sputtered out on its own. Detectives noticed she never blew the flame out. 5 years into the investigation, a new sheriff took office. He reviewed the case file, met with the Mercer family, and promised to give the case renewed attention. His efforts lasted several months, until a spree of burglaries overwhelmed the department. The cold case folder was moved to a lower shelf. Officers still referenced it occasionally, but the urgency was gone. 10 years passed. Eli would have been 20 by then. Teachers who still remembered him sometimes mentioned his name in staff meetings, catching themselves before emotion broke through. Jonah, one of the boys who had been with him that night, carried guilt well into adulthood, convinced on some level that he should have done something different, though no one could ever tell him what that might have been. The Turner family, who lived near the ridge, insisted for years that strange noises echoed through the windbreak late at night. By the time anyone took the claim seriously, heavy rains had reshaped the landscape, washing away any trace that might have been useful. The case file was formally reclassified as inactive on the 50th anniversary of the disappearance. The sheriff at the time wrote a short note: "No new leads. Limited potential for recovery. Recommend archival." No one told the Mercer family directly. They learned about it weeks later from a neighbor who had overheard two officers talking on the street. Eli's mother walked into the station the next morning, calm and composed, and asked if the rumors were true. The sheriff nodded. She didn't cry. She simply said, "Then we'll wait without you." The file was boxed, labeled, and moved into long-term storage alongside dozens of other cold cases. Dust slowly gathered on the lid. Officers who hadn't been in Pine Hollow during the original investigation barely recognized the name. In the final page of the archived report, the closing summary read, "Multiple leads exhausted, no body recovered, no viable suspect identified," but a sentence scrawled in pencil at the bottom, likely by a deputy who struggled to let the case go, offered a quiet echo of hope. "Something's missing. We just don't know what." That line would remain the last entry for years. Time moves differently when someone is missing. For most families, years pass through holidays, school calendars, birthdays, seasons. But for the Mercers, years drifted in slow circles around one absence, never fully leaving the night their son disappeared. What they lost was not only a boy, but the sense of continuity that holds ordinary life together. Every year became an echo of the year before, repeating the same milestones without the same meaning. In the first decade, the house stayed almost completely unchanged. Eli's room remained exactly as he had left it. A small bed with a quilt his mother stitched when he was 6, a shelf filled with adventure books, a jar with stones arranged by color categories he had never explained. Dust settled lightly on the windowsill, but his mother wiped it away each Sunday as if dust were a kind of disrespect. She changed the sheets every spring. She placed a fresh glass of water on his desk every birthday. She kept his school photos in the same order in the hallway, aligned with careful precision. His father, less expressive but no less devastated, found himself lingering near the barn where Eli once worked beside him. Sometimes he stood at the doorway holding the old wrench Eli used to hand him during repairs. He said little about the memories, but Ryan occasionally caught him staring at the workbench with a weariness that didn't exist before the disappearance. Silence filled the barn, as though the world there had been paused mid-motion. Ryan carried a different kind of burden. He grew taller, started shaving, earned his driver's license, graduated high school. Yet each change felt like leaving his brother behind, as though he was stepping forward alone through the years while Eli remained forever 10. By the time he turned 18, he had adopted the quiet habit of sitting at the edge of the field behind the house at dusk. He looked toward the ridge where the boys had last ridden, as if willing time to rewind. Sometimes, when the wind moved the grass just right, he could almost imagine the sound of bicycle wheels humming along the gravel again. The family received letters throughout the early years, many from strangers who had read about the case. Some letters offered sympathy, others theories, others prayers. One small envelope came every year on the anniversary of LA's disappearance, always unsigned. Inside, a single sentence written in looping cursive: "We have not forgotten him. No one ever discovered who sent them." The Mercers kept every note in a drawer near the kitchen, tucked among faded birthday cards and school certificates. The physical reminders of the case changed too. The missing posters that once hung on telephone poles slowly faded. their colors washed by rain and sunlight until the papers turned nearly white. A photograph of Eli, stapled to the bulletin board in the local feed store, curled at the edges after years under the fluorescent lights. People in Pine Hollow began to glance at the photo less often, not out of indifference, but because the sight of it hurt in a way that offered no guidance, no resolution. As the years accumulated, so did the small betrayals of time. The voices of the boys who had been with Eli that night matured, shifting from childhood pitches to the deeper tones of adulthood. Their memories took on the uncertain softness that trauma and time create. They remembered impressions but not specifics, shadows but not shapes. Jonah, who had once been loud and fearless, grew into a man who avoided the road near the ridge entirely. Whenever asked, he said he simply preferred the main highway, though everyone knew the truth behind his detours. By the 15th year, Pine Hollow had changed its rhythm. New families moved in. Some didn't know of the disappearance until locals mentioned it. New businesses replaced old storefronts. The grain silo that once drew Eli and his friends was torn down after structural issues were discovered. The birch trees near the Mercer property grew taller, their trunks etched with the slow passage of time. Seasons arrived and left, yet grief remained lodged in the soil of the town like a buried stone no one could fully unearth. The Mercers, despite the weight of passing years, refused to let Eli vanish from their daily lives. Each Christmas, his mother placed a single wrapped gift under the tree, always labeled with his name and the year. She never opened them. The boxes collected on a shelf in the attic, forming a quiet testament to time that had moved forward without permission. His father repaired appliances in town for years, but he stopped taking jobs near the ridge. When someone mentioned the windbreak where Eli had disappeared, his expression tightened into a stillness so complete that people quickly changed the subject. He never spoke openly about the night the boys came running home, breathless and terrified. He carried the memory alone, tucked deep behind the careful control he showed the world. Ryan eventually left Pine Hollow for college, but even in distance the case shadowed him. He studied engineering, perhaps as a way to impose structure on a life defined by an event that had no sense of order. He came home for holidays, sitting with his mother in Eli's room, untouched and still smelling faintly of dust and sun-warmed wood. The room made him ache, yet he returned to it each time, as though it helped him remember who he was supposed to be before everything changed. When cell phones became common, his mother saved every message from unknown numbers, just in case. She read stories online about cold cases solved by chance phone calls or anonymous tips. Hope did not always feel like relief. Sometimes it felt like reopening an old wound. But she clung to it anyway, believing that as long as the world changed, there remained a possibility that the truth might emerge. On quiet evenings, she wrote letters to Eli in a small notebook with a green cover. They were conversational, gentle, like the kind of messages a mother might leave for a child who had gone to summer camp for the first time. She wrote about the weather, the flowers blooming near the porch, how Ryan was doing in school, which neighbors had moved away. She wrote about the birds nesting in the birch trees, the way frost formed delicate patterns on the windows each winter, the bread she baked when she missed him too much. She never read the letters aloud. She never showed them to anyone. They remained locked in a drawer in her bedroom, paper aging gently under the shifting decades. As technology advanced, the world offered tools that had not existed when the investigation began. DNA testing improved. Soil analysis became more precise. Digital records allowed investigators to retrace movements of people who had once seemed untrackable. News reports occasionally mentioned breakthroughs in other cases, stirring a small ember inside the Mercers that refused to die. In Pine Hollow, a community group began hosting annual candlelight walks in Eli's honor. Each year, fewer people attended, but those who did walked the long stretch of road that the boys had ridden that night. They moved quietly, candles swaying in the breeze, their steps soft against the gravel. The flicker of small flames created a line of gentle light, a reminder that the town still held his memory even as the rest of the world moved on. The sheriff who had archived the case retired. A younger detective took over some of the old cold case responsibilities, though his workload was heavy and the resources limited. One afternoon, while reorganizing storage boxes, he came across a file stamped with a date long before he joined the force. The label was faded, smudged, nearly unreadable. He opened it, curious. The first page he saw was the original missing child bulletin. He paused, reading it carefully. Something in the simplicity of the description struck him. A small boy riding his bicycle at dusk. A single flashlight strapped to the handlebars. He set the file aside, intending to revisit it during a quieter week. It would be months before he picked it up again. But the moment he placed the file on his desk, even without knowing it, the long dormant case had begun to stir. Dust shifted, paper rustled. The past leaned forward, sensing a chance it had not been afforded in years. In that small act, unnoticed and quiet, a sliver of hope found its way back into the story of Pine Hollow. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The evidence vault was colder than the rest of the building. A climate-controlled cavern of forgotten tragedies stacked neatly in cardboard and plastic. Detective Mara Leland moved slowly down the aisles, scanning labels faded by decades. She had taken over a portion of the cold case review project, expecting little more than routine sorting. Yet something in her resisted the idea of simply cataloging and shelving the past. She believed that silence could be broken if someone returned to the beginning with enough patience. The box that changed everything did not stand out at first glance. Its label was incomplete, a smudged number too faint to read. The lid sagged slightly. It looked like any other artifact of a case long abandoned. But when she lifted it onto the cart and opened it, she felt the faint tremor of instinct tightening at the base of her spine. Inside lay a single object sealed in an old plastic sleeve, a black flashlight, scratched and dulled, as if it had been dragged across something rough. A brittle paper tag beneath it noted the recovery date, 5 days after Eli disappeared. The note offered no explanation, only a short phrase written in hurried handwriting. Possible related item. She lifted the flashlight carefully. Its weight felt wrong. Heavier than a child's flashlight should have been. She unscrewed the end cap and found not batteries, but a tightly packed column of compacted soil. Someone had filled the flashlight deliberately. She sealed it in a fresh container, logged the find, and carried it straight downstairs to the forensic division. The object that had once guided a child through the dark had become a small vault of untouched evidence. Dr. Lena Kavanagh, the lead soil analyst, accepted the container with a focused calm that came from years of studying things overlooked by everyone else. She placed the flashlight under magnification, brushing away small flakes of rust. The scratches told a story immediately. They weren't random impact marks. They aligned in narrow striations consistent with barbed wire. Another analyst, Dr. Adrian Poe, ran light across the casing at different angles, watching how the groove shifted. He traced the pattern with a stylus, compared it to archived photographs of regional farm fencing, and confirmed what the line suggested. These scratches came from one type of fence installed primarily in Pine Hollow during the late 70s. Not many properties still had it by 1991. Only one lay along the route the boys had ridden, the old Holt property. Mara felt her breath catch. Holt had been interviewed once, then dismissed due to lack of evidence. His file was too thin, considering the proximity of his land to the disappearance. Dr. Kavanagh opened the flashlight and began extracting soil with delicate instruments. She separated fragments into small dishes, dark earth, tiny roots, granules of sand, flecks of decomposing plant matter. Over the next several days, she analyzed each component using spectrometry and comparative botanical mapping. When she called Mara in for results, her tone was subdued but certain. The pollen signatures matched a rare cluster of late-season buckthorn. Only a few pockets of buckthorn in Pine Hollow produced that exact combination of grains. All were within a half-mile of Holt's former property. The soil carried traces of a shallow depression typical of disturbed ground in moisture-protected environments, areas shielded from harsh weather. That meant the soil likely came from a sheltered location, not an exposed roadside. A place where roots could grow undisturbed, where the ground stayed cool and dense. A place someone might use to hide something. Mara reviewed the old records. Search teams had never entered Holt's western acres. Heavy vegetation and steep drop-offs made the terrain difficult, and early investigators believed the suspect had traveled north, not west. The assumption had cost 25 years. When the flashlight scratches were digitally overlaid onto a map of Holt's property, the alignment was unmistakable. At some point during Eli's abduction, the flashlight had struck Holt's fence. The boy had either been pulled or dragged near that boundary. A new search warrant was issued quietly. A week later, investigators combed Holt's abandoned acreage beneath a pale morning sky. They followed the map, the soil readings, and the deep-rooted buckthorn that had watched over the land for decades. Near a natural dip in the terrain, the dogs alerted. Beneath a thicket of branches hardened by years of growth, the earth shifted in a way that suggested it had once been disturbed. Within hours, they found remains. The scene felt suspended in time. Even the wind hesitated. Mara stood among the search team, her heart steady but heavy, knowing that hope and tragedy often walk side by side in cases like this. The discovery of the remains triggered the next phase, confronting the man who had lived his life under the quiet protection of assumption. Holt lived 3 states away now, alone, working occasional jobs. He answered the door calmly when officers arrived. When confronted with the findings, his face went still, eyes narrowing with the recognition of a past he had tucked away for decades. He agreed to come voluntarily for questioning. In the interview room, Mara placed the restored flashlight on the table, the metal dull beneath the overhead light. Holt stared at it for a long moment, jaw tightening. He admitted he had seen the boys on occasion, admitted he had driven along the ridge that week. But the story he told when he finally spoke was not what the detectives expected. He said he had not intended to kill the boy. He said the encounter escalated because the boy ran when he wasn't supposed to. He said he panicked. He described the sequence in a flat tone, as if recounting a memory he had tried to dull for years. He spoke of dragging Eli off the road, of moving him through the brush. He said the boy had tried to shine the flashlight toward the road, and he had taken it from him. He removed the batteries, filled the case with soil so the light would not give them away. When Mara asked where the soil came from, Holt mentioned a small hollow near a buckthorn stand, a temporary stop before the final burial site. That detail aligned precisely with the lab's soil analysis. But then came the twist. Holt insisted that the flashlight had not been dropped in the struggle. He had thrown it aside when the boy began crying. He said he had believed the flashlight would remain hidden where it fell. That meant the soil inside the flashlight did not come from the burial site. It came from the intermediate location, a place investigators had never searched. Teams returned to Holt's land again the next morning. Guided by Holt's recollection and the soil signatures, they inspected a series of sheltered depressions. At the second location, just yards from the earlier discovery, they found fragments of clothing and a small personal item, a broken piece of leather strap, consistent with the one used to fasten the flashlight to Eli's bicycle. The strap had torn cleanly, confirming that force had separated it. The new find completed the picture that had been incomplete for so many years. And with the confession, the soil, the strap, and the body, the case assembled itself into the shape the town had tried to imagine for decades. The silence around the Holt property cracked open, revealing not just a crime but a truth that had been buried beneath years of assumption. News spread through Pine Hollow the same afternoon. Phones rang in grocery stores, workplaces, schools. Older residents called one another with trembling voices. Some cried openly in the aisles of the local market. Others set down their shopping carts and walked outside, needing air, space, something to hold on to. The Mercer family received the call in the early evening. They were told the remains belonged to their son. They were told the man responsible had confessed. They were told that, after 25 years of silence, the truth had surfaced at last. His mother sank into a chair, hands trembling, eyes closing as relief and grief collided in a way she did not yet have words for. His father stood behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Ryan stared at the floor, emotion rising in waves he tried to contain. In Pine Hollow, porch lights flickered on before the sun had fully set. People stepped outside, standing quietly as the sky faded into the kind of dusk that once carried 3 boys on bicycles into the unknown. This time, the darkness felt different. It held not fear, but closure. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning officers arrived at Holt's small rental home. The air carried a muted stillness, the kind that often surrounds moments where truth can no longer be postponed. He answered the door without hesitation, looking older than his years, shoulders rounded from a life of working quietly at the edges of towns. The officers informed him that new evidence placed him at the center of the Mercer case. His expression tightened for the briefest moment, but he did not protest when they cuffed him. He simply nodded as if acknowledging something inevitable. Inside the patrol car, he stared straight ahead. The passing scenery reflected faintly in the window gas stations, roadside diners, farm stubble, all familiar landscapes suddenly rendered foreign by the weight of what he had finally admitted. The officers beside him exchanged few words. Justice, when it arrives after decades, often moves with a quiet gravity. At the station, Holt was processed and escorted to an interview room. He sat at the table with his hands folded awkwardly, as though unsure what to do with them now that they were no longer free. Detective Mara Leland entered with the same calm she carried throughout the investigation. She placed the evidence reports on the table and waited. Holt's confession, previously given in pieces, came again in a slow, even voice. He described the night as if recounting a worn memory. He said he had panicked when the boy tried to run. He said he had acted without thinking. He said he had buried Eli in haste, returning days later to adjust the site so animals wouldn't disturb it. His words were detached, as if he were trying to shift responsibility onto the confused urgency of his younger self. Mara listened without interruption, documenting each detail. She asked questions only when necessary, guiding him carefully through the timeline. When he hesitated, she waited. When he deflected, she redirected. He never asked for a lawyer. He never claimed innocence. What he offered instead was a confession shaped not by remorse, but by resignation. Once the statement was signed, prosecutors stepped in. They considered the evidence, the age of the case, and the possibility that a full trial might unravel under the weight of decades-old memories. Legal experts understood that convictions based on cold case reconstructions sometimes faltered. What mattered most to the Mercer family was the truth, and the truth had finally been spoken. A plea agreement was drafted. Holt would plead guilty to kidnapping and related charges. In exchange, the murder charge would be withdrawn. Some saw this as compromise. Others saw it as the clearest path to ensuring he remained behind bars. The Mercer family was consulted. The decision was theirs as much as the state's. After long discussion, they agreed. They valued certainty over spectacle. The court proceedings began on a chilly morning marked by a pale sunrise. People from Pine Hollow gathered early, standing in small clusters along the courthouse steps. Some carried programs from the candlelight walks. Others carried nothing but memory. Reporters from regional stations stood further back, murmuring into microphones, careful not to disturb the somber quiet that hung over the crowd. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere held its own gravity. Wooden benches polished by decades of use. High ceilings that caught every sound. A faint echo of footsteps whenever someone shifted. As the bailiff called the session to order, Holt entered wearing a plain jumpsuit. His wrists were shackled. He kept his head lowered. The judge reviewed the charges in a steady, measured voice. When asked how he pleaded, Holt answered, "Guilty," without emotion. The room remained silent. Families of other missing children sometimes attended cases like these, drawn by the need to witness justice unfold. Today, a few sat quietly behind the Mercer family, offering strength through presence alone. As the prosecutor summarized the evidence, he spoke with clarity but restraint. He described the flashlight, the soil, the barbed wire marks, the recovery of the remains. He explained how advancements in forensic science revealed what had once been impossible to detect. He emphasized the importance of the confession. At no point did he raise his voice or embellish the facts. This was a moment for truth, not performance. When the judge invited the Mercer family to speak, Eli's mother stood first. Her voice trembled softly, but she remained composed. She said she had waited 25 years to hear the truth. She said her son had been 10 years old, full of curiosity, full of grace, undeserving of the fear he had faced. She said she forgave Holt, not because he asked, but because carrying hatred for decades had already taken too much from her family. Eli's father spoke only one sentence. "My son deserved to grow up," he said, and then he sat down again, hands clenched tightly together. Ryan stepped forward last. Now an adult, he carried himself with a quiet steadiness, shaped by years spent living in the shadow of his brother's absence. He spoke about guilt, about how he had long believed he should have done something differently that night. He looked directly at Holt when he said, "You took him, but you didn't take who he was." The courtroom absorbed the words with a stillness that felt absolute. The judge delivered this sentence with the solemnity the moment required. Holt would serve decades in state prison, with no possibility of early release. The charge described in the plea carried enough weight to ensure he would never leave confinement. The legal system, slow and imperfect, had finally anchored the truth in a place where it could no longer be hidden. The paperwork was signed. The courtroom emptied gradually, people moving in quiet, reflective steps. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, as though Pine Hollow itself was exhaling after holding its breath for a generation. The Mercer family walked out together. Reporters approached, but the sheriff gently guided them aside. This moment was for the family, not for cameras. Eli's mother placed her hand on Ryan's back. His father paused on the courthouse steps, eyes scanning the early afternoon sky, a gesture so subtle that only those closest to him noticed. Detective Mara Leland observed from a distance. She had seen closures before, but this one carried a weight unlike any other. She thought about the dusty evidence vault, about the flashlight that had waited decades to be opened, about the soil that revealed more truth than any witness ever had. She wondered how many other cases across the state were resting on shelves, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. In Pine Hollow, news of the sentencing spread quickly. Some people cried. Some simply sat quietly, hands clasped together, absorbing the enormity of finally knowing. The church bells rang once, not as celebration, but as acknowledgement. Closure did not erase the pain of the past, but it allowed the town to step forward without carrying the same weight. That evening, the Mercer family returned home. They lit one candle on the dining table, the same ritual they had performed on every birthday, every anniversary of the disappearance. But this time, the flame held a different meaning. It flickered gently in the stillness, a small but steady light in a world that had once felt unbearably dark. For the first time in 25 years, the candle burned not for hope, but for peace. In the weeks after the sentencing, Pine Hollow settled into a new kind of quiet. It wasn't the sharp silence that had once followed Eli's disappearance, the kind that pressed against the edges of every thought. This quiet carried a gentler weight, softened by the knowledge that the truth had finally surfaced. People moved through town with a steadier pace, no longer glancing over their shoulders when dusk arrived. For the first time in decades, The dark felt like a natural part of the evening instead of a reminder of what had once been taken. The Mercer family learned to live inside this calmer silence. Eli's mother no longer kept his room as a shrine frozen in time. Instead, she opened the windows, letting in fresh air and morning light. She folded the quilt he loved and placed it at the foot of the bed. She kept the stones he sorted by color, not as relics of loss, but as small memories of who he had been. His father spent more time in the barn again, fixing old equipment with the patience he passed on to both of his sons. Sometimes he paused, touching the worn handle of the wrench Eli once used, but the moments no longer crushed him. They simply reminded him of a boy who had loved learning how things worked. Ryan carried his brother's memory into adulthood with more balance now. For years he had avoided the ridge, circling away from it as if the road still held their last shared breath. But one afternoon, after the case closed, he walked along that stretch until the shadows grew long across the gravel. He stopped at the fence line and stood still, letting the cool air settle around him. For the first time, he felt something close to peace. A chapter of his life, shaped by fear and guilt, had finally released its hold. Pine Hollow built a small memorial path near the place where Eli once played with his friends, bordered by stones donated by families around town. At its center stood a simple plaque engraved with his name and the years he lived. People visited quietly, leaving candles or wildflowers. Some came to reflect on their own losses. Others came because they remembered the boy who once rode his bicycle with a flashlight bouncing gently against the handlebars. That flashlight became a symbol beyond its small shape and simple purpose. For investigators, it was a reminder of how even the smallest overlooked detail can change the course of a case. For the Mercer family, it represented the light Eli always wanted to carry, even when the world around him grew dim. And for Pine Hollow, it stood for the idea that truth, like light, has a way of enduring, sometimes hidden, sometimes forgotten, but never truly gone. Detective Mara Leland returned to the evidence vault one last time, standing in the aisle where she first opened the box that had slept untouched for decades. She didn't stay long. She didn't need to. The lesson of the case lingered with her, that persistence matters, that silence can be broken, and that time, despite its slow erosion, often preserves more truth than it destroys. In the end, the story of Eli Mercer became more than a tragedy. It became a testament to patience, to love that refuses to fade, and to a community learning that justice can arrive even after hope has thinned to its faintest form. The years of searching, grieving, and waiting shaped Pine Hollow into a place that understands both the fragility and resilience of human connection. And on quiet nights, when the wind moves gently through the birch trees along the Mercer property, the leaves rustle with a softness that feels almost like a reply. The darkness no longer feels empty. It feels complete. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.